Hello, thanks for joining me. My name is Sai Pullabhutla. I am the author of Catatumbo. Catatumbo is a JPA-like persistence framework that is specifically designed for Google's Cloud Datastore. Um, if you're not familiar with Google Cloud Datastore, it is a NoSQL data store that is fully managed by Google in their cloud infrastructure. You can learn more about Catatumbo by visiting catatumbo.io. There is a bunch of information and document available on the website. In this tutorial, this is going to be a multi-part tutorial on Catatumbo, and I wanted to keep each part short and sweet. So in the part one, this is going to be for beginners who are just starting with Google's Cloud Data Store. In this part, I'm going to show you how to create a brand new Google Cloud project, enabling the Datastore API, getting the credentials to access the data store, and then we will also make sure we can actually use the data store by using Google's Cloud Console. So this is for beginners who are not at all familiar with Google's Cloud Data Store. And then in part two, we will actually jump into some coding. And in this session, we'll basically get started with Catatumbo. We'll set up a brand new Maven-based project. We'll connect to the Google's Cloud Data Store. I'll show you how to connect to a data store emulator on your local system. We'll write some code to perform CRUD operations, and then we will learn about a bunch of very basic annotations that are in the Catatumbo framework. In part three, I'm going to cover entity groups. Entity groups basically form a parent-child hierarchy in the Google's Cloud Data Store. In this session, we'll specifically talk about the following two annotations, key and parent key. Coming to part four, we will cover embedded objects. Embedded objects are basically complex objects embedded within your entity or model class. I will show you how the framework can persist those embedded objects. We will discuss about the supporting annotations that make this happen. Part 5, I will cover about inheritance. Entity classes can inherit other classes. We'll specifically talk about the mapped superclass annotation and write some sample code. Part 6, persisting collections. So within the Cloud Data Store, you can actually persist array properties. So in this session, I'm going to show you how you could persist a list property, a set, a map. I'll show you how you could have a collection of primitive types or the corresponding wrapper types, for example, int versus integer. And then I'm also going to show you how collections of embedded objects could be persisted into the Cloud Data Store. Coming to the next part, we'll write code we'll learn all about queries. Catatumbo supports querying through GQL. So we'll learn about entity queries, projection queries, key queries or key only queries. And then I'll show you some sample code on how to set parameters when running a query using either positional binding or named binding. And then I'll also demonstrate how we can get only a page of results and then navigate to the next page using cursors. And then we'll talk about a little bit about composite indexes, which is something you need to have in order to run projection queries or to run complex queries where you want to search on multiple properties of an entity. Part 8, we'll talk about entity listeners. Entity listeners basically provide a callback uh, during persistence operations. For example, if you are updating an entity, we could the Catatumbo framework could call back a method that you define um, to indicate, hey, I'm just about to update this entity, and you can add some logic to it, or it could be post update as well. So in this session, I'm going to cover all about entity listeners and write some sample code to demonstrate the features. Part 9, we'll discuss about transactions and batch writes. And then finally, in part 10, I'm going to cover some miscellaneous topics. We'll start with optimistic locking, which is a feature provided by the Catatumbo framework. Um, and then we'll dive into some of the advanced topics such as overriding default mappers, creating custom mappers and attaching them to your entities. And then we'll talk about custom secondary indexes. With that, let's get back. Let's talk about part 1. The first and foremost thing is we need to have a Google Cloud project in order to access the Google Cloud Datastore. So in this, I'm going to show you how you could set up a project. So first go to cloud.google.com, and from here you can log into the console. Now if you have never signed up for the cloud services, you may have to sign up. For my account, I'm already signed up for the cloud account. So once you're signed up, you should get to your dashboard, which may be empty if you didn't have any projects. Um, let's go ahead and create a brand new project. I already have a couple of projects here. I'm going to create a brand new project now. I'm going to just give it a name called Catatumbo tutorial, and make a note of this project ID here. The project name and project ID may not be the same, but in order to connect to the data store, we need the project ID. Again, we can always find the project ID from the console, so you don't have to actually write it down. Let's go ahead and create the project. Now it's going to take a minute or two for the project creation to complete and initialize. All right, our project has been created and it has been set as my current project. So now let's make sure the Datastore API is enabled. So here is a link to enable and manage APIs. So basically, per project basis, you can choose what should be enabled in this project and what should not be. So let's go ahead and click on that link. And now notice that the page says some APIs are enabled automatically. So let's see. In the API section, we're specifically looking for Cloud Datastore API. That's already enabled because we are getting an option to disable it. So we don't have to do anything here if it's already enabled. Now let's go to the credentials section and create brand new credentials so we can access this data store. So select a service account key, and the fastest way is to just create Compute Engine default service account. Now the key type, you need to make sure you're selecting JSON as the format. Click on create. Now what this does is creates a key pair for authentication, and this is a one-time download that you're going to get. The private key has been downloaded to your downloads folder. you cannot retrieve this private key from the cloud console again. You can definitely create new keys, but this is a one-time deal, so make sure you save this key in a safe place. All right, so now let's make sure we can actually access the cloud data store from the console. Let's go to the main menu here and click on data store. Now the first time, so the data store is empty, we can create a brand new entity here. The very first time, you need to select the location in which you want to store the data. So I'm going to select US Central here and click Next. This will initialize our data store services in the selected location, which may take a minute or two again. All right, our data store is now initialized and we can actually create an entity. Um, so let's go ahead and the kind here is basically what type of entity you want to create. This is analogous to a table name if you are coming from the RDBMS world. So let's say we want to create a kind called person, and then every entity must have a key. The key could either be numeric or a string. If it is numeric, Google can assign ID automatically. Um, for strings, you have to specify an ID by yourself. Let's go ahead and create some properties now. Let's start with person has a first name, and then a value, and then add one more property, last name. Let's go ahead and create the entity now. All right, now we have our person, um, which has one record. You can look at the details here. The key is basically made up of both the kind as well as the actual ID, and shows that there are two properties, first name and last name. Now if you edit this entity and click, now notice that it's saying the property is indexed. Both properties are indexed. When a property is indexed, you can find an entity by searching within an indexed field. Otherwise, if a property is not indexed, you will never be able to find it or sort it. But I think our data store is ready now, and we should be able to write some sample code, which I will cover in the second section or second part of the tutorial. With that, I would like to conclude this session. Thanks for watching. See you in the next session.